today's lecture is morality and antisocial behaviour. So the first part is mainly morality, and the second part is kind of aggression, anger, other things related to that. So before I kind of go through the structure of the lecture, I'll give you a few kind of dilemmas to test your moral mettle. So I don't know whether you're familiar with this one, but here you are this person, okay? A trolley car or a tram is out of control. If it continues down the current track, it will crash into 5 hikers who are crossing the line. If it is switched to a side track, it will kill only 1 hiker who happens to be crossing on this part of the line. Okay? So the idea is, you control the switch. What do you do? Do you switch the trolley to kill this person, or keep it on this line here? Okay. Well, how many people would switch and kill this person? Okay, yeah, but is there anybody who feels strongly that they would keep it on the same path? Okay, right, that's fine, good. It gets harder. Okay. Right, let's have a look at this one. So this is called the Footbridge Dilemma. So again, we've got a runaway trolley car or tram that's out of control, and again, it's going to kill these 5 hikers. So you have to buy into the line that these people are going to be killed, okay? So you're having to make some assumptions. Now, you're this guy here. But the idea is that you can stop this trolley or tram by pushing this man, in the dilemma they refer to him as a fat man, in front of the train tracks, so that this person gets killed and the 5 hikers do not. So you have to accept the premises of it. Now the question here is, what do you do? Do you push this person off in order to save the 5? So how many people would push him off in order to save the 5? Okay, there's always a few who do. How many people wouldn't? Yeah, so the most common, so here this tends to be more split. Here it tends not to be split. Here the most common response is not to push the man off the bridge in order to save the 5 lives. Well, that's right, yes. Okay, well, we'll come back to you then. Okay, so this is the organ donor dilemma. So now we've got 5 people who are being rushed into ER. Each person needs a different organ transplant to stay alive. Unfortunately, the organs aren't available, but there is a patient with minor injuries in the waiting room who can be killed in order to extract the 5 organs to save lives. So you just said it's weighing up 1 life for 5. So what do you make of this one? Have you changed your mind?
No, it just died. I'm not killing.
Yeah, you're not. Okay, so it's not always. So basically, here, mathematically, you've got 1 life versus 5, but there are some other things going on. People find it hard to justify why they change their mind. When they do this, some people change their mind here and there, and some people change from there to there, but very few people stay with it at this point. Okay, so I'll come back to this, but one of the things we'll look at is what goes on in the brain, what kind of judgments are being done here, what happens if you've got damage to the brain, what happens if you're a murderer or a psychopath, how do you respond in these dilemmas. Okay, so the first half we'll look at morality, what are kind of morals, how do we define and measure them, what are the kind of processes that underpin them. And in the second part, we'll talk about anger and aggression, kind of its basis in the brain, whether it's a good or bad thing, and insofar as we can make that kind of evaluation. So, antisocial behaviour is just kind of, we can think of that as being any behaviour that violates the norms of a culture. And it's not necessarily illegal behaviour, but the idea is that it's kind of a violation of a standard. So for instance, swearing or kind of shouting loudly in public aren't typically illegal, although they could be in some contexts, but they're typically classed as antisocial. So you could think of the law as kind of being a way of kind of defining or codifying, what is and what isn't a norm or a standard, and obviously here we've got complex legal systems. In other cultures it might be word of mouth or more agreed kind of verbal consensus, but that's the basic idea. And also there's a sense in which there are different kinds of norm that may have rather different bases, both in terms of the sorts of mechanisms that support them. So people make a distinction between what are called moral norms and conventional norms. So a moral norm are things that involve the rights and welfare of the people. So for instance, that hitting somebody in the face is wrong, for instance, would be a kind of a moral norm violation. A conventional norm would be if you guys started just chatting in the middle of the class, okay? It's not a moral violation, but it's kind of breaking a consensus as to how this class operates, okay? So the idea is that they probably have different kind of bases. The idea behind moral norm, or one idea, is that these arise more from a concern for others, probably involving empathy, a lot of the other mechanisms that we've talked about. Here, this is more kind of tradition, group conformity, your own personal experience, and other things. I wouldn't like to put these as completely black and white. It's very easy to find things which are on the cusp, and some things like, you know, the hemline and the skirt, some cultures would think of this as a moral norm. We would tend to think of that as kind of a conventional norm that just exists through tradition and so on, and isn't, you know, an issue to do with morality. So there are, you know, things can slip between these categories, but the idea is that there are different ways of kind of thinking about problems. So we've got different kinds of norms, and really there are different kind of senses of what is right and wrong. So we can think of morality just in very basic terms as judgments of right and wrong, okay? So one basis of moral judgment is whether it feels right or wrong. So this is kind of gut instinct or intuition. So again, you know, in some of these dilemmas, people have a strong sense of what the correct answer is for them, but they can't always kind of rationalize it or explain it very well in detail. Also, there's a sense of right or wrong in terms of kind of consensus and so on. So these are kind of the more social norm ideas, that basically whether something's right or wrong depends on how it's defined by the law. And this is kind of, you know, how the criminal justice system works. If you say, well, it felt right to me to go and, you know, kick that guy in or whatever, you're still going to fall foul of this one here. But sometimes people are aware of the law, but their judgment of right or wrong is based on their own kind of sense of what is right or wrong to them, in effect, and not on other things. And then here we've effectively got what's seen as being kind of a more rational or kind of cost-benefit analysis. And that's a kind of an outcome-based focus. What are the net gains and the net losses? So here, an emphasis on this kind of thing is often kind of associated with something called utilitarianism, that basically you think about whether or not the outcome is worth doing. So here, for instance, thinking that saving 5 lives and killing 1, here that is a kind of a utilitarian judgment, that you're saying that you're focusing on the outcomes here. So the classic kind of example of this would be things like torture, for instance. Is it okay to torture one person in order to save the lives potentially of 100 people that they might kind of disclose some key information? And again, we have an idea that it isn't, but you can find quotes even from politicians saying things that, like waterboarding and, you know, psychological torture, are justified simply because it justifies the end point. So they're concentrating on the outcome will be, yes, there will be greater gains from this, even though, you know, it's not something I'm entirely comfortable with. So again, you can look at these different things. And really the way we can think about this in terms of cognition or information processing is that at any point in time you've got all these sources of information, and the question is your moral judgment will be an outcome of one of these sources of information. Often they're all in line, so what feels right to you should hopefully be what's kind of enshrined in the law and should produce the net benefit. So the idea is that in general these 3 things work in parallel, or we change the law if things don't kind of feel right with, you know, with whatever the zeitgeist is. Okay? But sometimes you've got competing information where the utilitarian answer is to do one thing and there are other things tugging at you saying not to do that. So torture being the kind of classic example. Okay, so this is kind of, you know, setting the ground. So we've talked about different kinds of convention, different kinds of biases, and broadly speaking, you can map this onto different kinds of cognitive processes. So if we go back to this first process, is kind of your emotional parts of the brain, your gut instinct. This here is just your kind of social knowledge, and this here is in effect your kind of reasoning or kind of rational thinking. And often the kind of debate is kind of focused around these last two. Are you basing your moral judgments based on your intuition, your gut instincts, your kind of emotional feelings, your empathy and so on, or is it more a cognitive reasoning? So for instance, in the trolley and footbridge dilemma, most people don't know what the correct answer is for this. They can't kind of point to what the law says is right or wrong. Actually, if you don't, in the first case in which you switch the train down the track, if you don't do that, you're actually culpable legally, that you should have pulled the switch, for instance. But most people aren't aware of this, so they have to go on some other source of information, such as their gut instinct or some kind of, well, you know, one's better than five. You know. So Piaget and Kohlberg effectively had took the position that moral judgment is one of reasoning, so it's kind of cold cognition, it's kind of thinking through problems, executive functions, you know, the lateral frontal lobes, and so on. The kinds of paradigm they would have is that they would again introduce these narratives or scenarios that, you know, it's not free healthcare, but somebody's wife is dying, they need access to medication, they can't afford the medication, the husband breaks into a pharmacist in order to get the medication. Is this morally acceptable? And people kind of explain their reasoning, and then you score what that reasoning is. So here, this is kind of almost like being a mini philosopher, that you kind of weigh up all the evidence and that there are ways in which you describe this and you score it one way or another. And they kind of argue this comes on very late in development and so on. What Haidt effectively argues is that people make their moral judgments effectively on emotional intuition, and the reasoning is effectively acts as a post hoc justification. That you kind of say, right, that's okay, and you've got a gut instinct, it's okay. When you have to engage in this, you come up with a plausible story that kind of fits your own intuition as to what is right or wrong. So he kind of argues that this is something that happens very late. People have a gut instinct, kind of physiologically or whatever, and that this drives their judgment, and then they engage in all kinds of post hoc justification for their judgment. And really, you know, to some extent, you can look at this using social neuroscience as to what is going on. And is often the case, it's a mixture of the two, and it depends on the context, and it depends a little bit on the person. So Haidt has argued that that emotional intuition is important, and he's introduced this whole kind of class of emotions, which he calls moral emotions. And these are things like guilt, shame, embarrassment, pride, anger, certain forms of disgust, pity, gratitude, and so on. Okay. So he argues that this is what kind of drives moral reasoning, is whether or not you kind of are feeling angry or shameful or guilty and so on. And you can divide them up in various ways. So guilt is something that's self-critical, whereas anger is something that's other critical. For instance, that somebody else has done wrong. Guilt means that you've done wrong. But in order to generate these moral emotions, the idea is that you are using the kind of standard part of the emotional brain, but you have then a kind of an internal standard that you apply. So what you're effectively measuring is the discrepancy between your own behaviour or other people's behaviour and whatever your standard of behaving is. So some people have very high standards of behaviour and they would probably feel guilty a lot of the time. Other people would have low standards of behaviour and so on. So the standards themselves are kind of somewhat flexible, but the idea is that the moral emotions are kind of pegged relative to that. So if you want to think about this in other species, in order to have morality in other species, you would have to have some way of having standard behaviour, okay, and being able to think about that standard behaviour either intuitively or via some kind of reasoning process. Okay, so this is how he looks at that. So so I'll talk about some data. That's kind of covering quite a lot of ideas, but they will be fleshed out. Is there anything that you kind of want to clarify? Okay, so when I go through the examples, it might be clear. So this is a study looking at moral emotions in which participants are in fMRI scanner and they're just being presented with images. There isn't a task, or not an obvious kind of relevant task. And they're shown moral violations, so an image of somebody hitting somebody in the face or whatever. They're shown an aversive image, so a kind of a growling dog or something like this. Pleasant images and neutral images. And they got people to rate these images subjectively. So people rate the moral violation and the kind of negative emotion one as being equally aversive to them. Kind of surprises me that you get an image set that works like that. And then these are equally rated as equally effective. So they did some quite nice groundwork here in terms of trying to equate for other factors. And what you find is that emotional images, so the top three here relative to neutral, activate this common set of regions such as the amygdala and the insula, for instance. And that's true of both moral and aversive and kind of, non-moral emotional images. But what you also have is that when you're shown this moral violation, you activate other regions such as your orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in kind of contextual regulation of emotion, and also this region here, which has been linked specifically to theory of mind, although the function of this posterior, that's superior temporal sulcus, it's kind of near temporoparietal junction. These are similar, well, this is kind of more theory of mind related regions as well, regions that are linked with thinking about others, mental states and bodies. So the idea is that it is tapping a lot of the kind of system that we've talked about, in lecture after lecture, but there is this difference between kind of moral defined here. And the way that they think about moral,
do patients with lesions in these regions have moral deficits?
Yes, we'll come to that. Yeah. They do badly on the Footbridge Dilemma. Yeah. They push the man off. Yeah. Here, don't worry if you also agree with them as well. It's about 25% of people who haven't got any problems in this brain region also push the man off. So don't worry. So their idea here is that what moral emotions are, they're effectively using this pattern of brain activity to say, well, moral emotions are using a kind of a core affect system, plus this kind of reasoning. But here they're talking about social reasoning, theory of mind, reasoning about intentions, rather than kind of a logical, mathematical form of reasoning, in the way that it's kind of been understood in the more kind of Piaget-based literature on morality. Here, this is the same kind of approach. We're using narratives rather than images. The thing here is that they have moral versus conventional scenarios. And my recollection of them here is that a moral transgression is crashing your car into somebody on the pavement, for instance, and a conventional transgression is puking in the street. Those were some of the examples that they have. Okay. And what they also have is that they vary this along with whether or not there is a presence or absence of an onlooker. Okay? So what they find here, so they again find activity in regions involved in cognitive control, not the theory of mind network in this particular example. This region here is more your kind of executive functions rather than theory of mind way of thinking about this. And what you find is that you get activity in this kind of reasoning network in the moral situation, irrespective of whether or not an onlooker was present or not. But in the conventional transgression, the puking in the street, it matters whether somebody saw you or not. So the kind of way of thinking about this, or the way that people think about moral versus conventional transgressions, is that moral transgressions are always wrong, and conventional transgressions are wrong in the presence of others' kind of judgments, in effect. So, for instance, if you think about even with something like is it morally wrong to wear short skirts? In most cultures, it isn't morally wrong if you're in private. It only becomes morally wrong in public. So that would be a kind of a conventional transgression with that. And the idea is that throwing up in public is kind of seen as being more wrong if somebody sees you than not, whereas knocking somebody over is wrong irrespective of whether or not there is somebody seeing you. So the idea is that you have these different bases that you're drawing upon in terms of moral versus more conventional basis, and the way that you'll kind of engage the brain in your kind of high-level reasoning about the event depends on the context as well as on the nature of the dilemma that you're contemplating. Okay. So both of these last studies, the one of Moll using these images of somebody hitting them, and the Finger et al. Study where you've got puking versus running someone over, here there is no decision. There is no decision making involved. You're just listening to a narrative, or you're viewing an image. And there isn't really a dilemma as well. You're not having to evaluate different kinds of information. So what about if we use a dilemma in which you're having to evaluate different information, in which there might be conflicting sources? So here, Green et al. Looked at the Footbridge and trolley dilemmas and other similar dilemmas. So the other example that's often cited, which you do hear about on the news, is that you've got a group of villagers hiding in a cellar with an infant crying. Outside, you've got a group of guerrillas, so armed guerrillas rather than ragtags, who are effectively wanting to come and murder everyone in the village. The baby's crying. Do you put your hand over the baby's mouth or not in order to save the rest of the village? That's the other kind of dilemma that's the equivalent of the trolley and footbridge dilemma, and there are reported cases of this happening in various places. So you're given these dilemmas here. And they classify them as personal or impersonal dilemmas. Sorry, so if I go back to these, just to remind you. So the idea why people don't push the man off in this case is that here, that you're having to kind of personally be involved in this, that this person is an innocent bystander, and that you are having to kind of engage in an act of aggression or violence towards that person, in effect. Whereas in this case, the idea is that that everybody's on the track, so everybody kind of has an equal status. So, but also you're doing a lever. So people debate what it is about these two dilemmas. And for some people, it's the fact that one is an act of pushing versus an act of lever throwing. Other people have argued it's the fact that this person's already on the lines, whereas this person isn't actually in any danger until you put them in danger. So that, again, people debate what is the source of this different thing here, but essentially the most common idea is that one is seen as being impersonal and one is personal. Any kind of comments about this? Yeah.
Are there any hybrids where, for instance, in this example, you pull a lever and the person slides?
Correct, yes, that's right, and people change it there. So there is a hybrid here where you pull a lever and it catapults the person off, for instance. But here you get, but then you get an intermediate level of agreement, and they've also done it with things like gorillas and chimpanzees instead of men. And people are more willing to push a chimpanzee or a gorilla off than they are another human, for instance. On average, it's. And effectively what you find is that when you have your personal dilemma, so the personal dilemma is the footbridge, where you're having to push the man off the bridge or smother the crying infant, that here, perhaps unsurprisingly, you're activating your emotional brain and your kind of theory of mind areas. With your impersonal dilemmas, you're activating this more lateral prefrontal cortex and so on. So the impersonal dilemma is the trolley dilemma, where you can imagine this as being a more five versus one kind of reasoning decision in which you haven't got a conflicting kind of personal thing. So here you've got your medial frontal lobes, your theory of mind, and so on here. And here you've got your kind of, this is more your executive function network, which is activated more by the non-moral and the impersonal ones. Yeah, so people talk, this about what the why it is that people make these judgments, And the fact that it's not entirely obvious and that there are different interpretations is interesting, because it implies that you are using a very kind of basic kind of heuristic that you can't quite tell or explain in a detailed way to other people. And Hauser talks about this. He's got a book called Moral Minds that talks about various ways in which people have interpreted these dilemmas. Okay. So there is cross-cultural variability in what people are willing to say is moral versus not. Here, this is done in the States, where people are asked to also rate themselves as being very liberal or very conservative in terms of their outlook, I guess politically. And here, what they're asked to do is to say how relevant morality is to a series of things. So basically, every group has what I've kind of considered moral norms as coming out at the top. So a moral norm would be rules about harming others, that it's wrong to harm others and so on, or fairness, that it's not right to kind of cheat or exploit, the kind of things that we'd talked about in the kind of neuroeconomic lecture. But people differ more on these things here in terms of whether or not loyalty to an in-group or loyalty to the government here. So, is it okay to sometimes go against what the government says, or, willingness to protest, purity of mind and body and so on. Again, people differ in whether or not these are moral judgments versus something that is effectively consensus based or kind of top-down. So with more conservative thinkers kind of applying morality more across the board, and more liberal thinkers having a clearer divide between issues to do with harm and fairness versus issues to do with effectively the group, in-groups, out-groups, and so on, community-based spirit and so on, that it's right to look after your own community, these kinds of endorsing those sorts of statements. But there are some that are seen as being relatively universal. So it's not a very nice topic, but there's a whole literature about incest. And there's this thing called the Westermarck effect, which is seen as being a biological mechanism that basically you cannot fall in love with people who you know in the first few years of life. And this typically applies to brothers and sisters, but actually will apply to friends and people that you've grown up with. And the idea is you're not quite sure who your family is, but there becomes a point at which you can fall in love with childhood friends, but not from a certain period. It's very hard. And there's lots of kind of anthropological studies on this, where they look at cultures in which you've got arranged marriages, but in which the children are raised together. Obviously, they're not made to have sex or whatever until puberty, but they are brought up together from infancy or very young childhood. And you can show there are critical windows at which that marriage will work and at which it will not work. And there's also studies in other species as well as to why some species will or will not mate with their family, in effect. So here the idea is that kind of cultural taboos around incest and so on are kind of, are grounded in moral instincts about this. And Height's also done kind of moral dilemmas around incest as well. So one of his ones is that you've got a brother and sister who really love each other and they want to have consensual sex. Is that morally acceptable? Okay, you can see people who are really struggling with that idea. And the idea is that their logic or their rational brain is saying, yes, that could be okay. And their gut instinct is saying, no, okay? And he kind of pits this sort of dilemma against other dilemmas. And this one comes out as a very strong taboo. Even when you say that they're using protection, there's no possibility that a child will be born. It's entirely consensual. Most people refuse to buy into that as being right. Okay. Right, so the orbitofrontal cortex, what can we say about that? So this came up as a question. So this is the famous case of Phineas Gage. who basically had, you all know Phineas Gage, but basically he was working on a railroad. He was packing explosives into the ground with a metal rod. The explosives went off and the metal rod went through the top of his head. He could walk and talk even after the metal rod had shot up out of the top of his head. And he went into Barnum's Circus with his, carrying his tapping rod with him, but he had personality change. And coming back to the second part of the lecture, he had problems in kind of social regulation, antisocial behaviour. So he meets a diagnostic criteria for what is now called antisocial personality disorder. Insofar as, well, he wasn't assessed at the time, but based on his kind of personality checklist, he would meet that kind of clinical diagnostic. So the question is, how would somebody like Phineas Gage perform on moral judgment? So this is the Damasios. So the Damasios also did a reconstruction of Phineas Gage's brain to see where his brain damage is, but they've also worked with lots of patients who have damage to the orbitofrontal cortex.
In 1861, one of the most celebrated patients in medical history died in San Francisco. His name was Phineas Gage, and 13 years earlier, he'd been the victim of a freak accident. He was buried without autopsy. But in 1994, using computerized brain imaging techniques, the husband and wife team of Hannah and Antonio Damasio performed a virtual autopsy using an electronic scalpel. Working with his railroad gang in Vermont, Gage was dynamiting large rocks when a tamping rod, more than a yard long and 1.25 inches in diameter, blasted up through his cheek, behind his eye, and out of the top of his skull. Astonishingly, he survived. He was still intelligent. His language and memory were intact. But he was a radically different person. As his colleagues put it, Gage was no longer Gage. The likable, hard-working, socially responsible character became untrustworthy, used profane language, and lied to his friends. It was as if the rod had destroyed the moral compass in his brain. The Damasios' detective work struck an immediate chord because several of their patients at the University of Iowa were, in a sense, modern Phineas Gages.
We have a large number of patients, neurological patients, who as a result of diseases have damage in certain sectors of the brain. It's a little hard to picture it, but you can think of them especially in the front part of the brain. And when there is damage in those areas, what happens is that patients become unable to read certain social clues out in society. So they will have difficulty picking up the significance of a facial expression or the significance of, for instance, a shrugging of the shoulders. And likewise, those patients will also not be able to perform in relation to what is expected in terms of the social contract.
You see those okay, Joe?
Meet Joe. Until a stroke in 1989, he was a high-energy, creative outdoorsman with a cheerful, fun-loving personality. Now, according to his wife, Dee, he's always in neutral.
A windmill.
This experiment gets to the heart of Joe's problem.
A woman and a little boy.
The electrodes are recording his skin conductance response, a measure of his emotional state.
Picture of a skinny man.
How skinny?
Awful skinny. Somebody ice skating. There's a man burning himself.
Typically, people generate a strong skin conductance response to the disturbing pictures, but not to the routine, bland ones. And yet, no matter what the picture, Holocaust victim or smiling child, Joe's response is flat, outside and in. Intellectually, he understands what he's seeing, but emotionally, he doesn't connect. Like Phineas Gage, Joe has lost key components of his social brain. The evolved mechanisms that, behind the scenes, smoothly process and integrate reason and emotion have been damaged.
The goal of the game is to guess at which decks you can make the most money off of.
To test his ideas about the social brain, Damasio uses experiments designed with his colleague Antoine Béchara. They're called the gambling experiments.
In front of you there are 4 decks of cards.
You're hooked up to a polygraph machine and told to keep turning over cards from any of the 4 decks.
I'll give you some money each time you select a card.
With every card, you win play money. 2 of the decks pay $100, but they have an unexpected sting in the tail. You might have to pay the experimenter, sometimes as much as $1,250.
So you owe me $200.
With the other 2 decks, you win only $50, but the possible penalty is much smaller, less than $100 on average. The goal of the game is to make as much money as you can, so it has some of the same elements as the game of life. Uncertainty, some risk, punishment and reward, and a blend of reasoning and intuitions.
You win $50, but you lose $50, so it's even.
Initially, I did what most people do, favor the 2 high-paying decks. That is, until the experimenter started demanding big penalties.
So you owe me $50.
Having learned my lesson, I eventually curbed my gambling impulses and shuffled over to the safety of the other 2 low-payment, low-punishment decks.
You win $100.
Typically, over 100 plays, a normal subject will retreat to the safer decks about 70% of the time. Damasio's frontal lobe patients do the exact opposite. By halfway through the game, they're often bankrupt, which has happened to some of them in real life following their brain damage. Now, how can their judgment, their prediction of future consequences, be so disastrous? Damasio believes there may be a tantalizing clue in the polygraph responses. As the game went on, my graph showed a new trace that wasn't there at the beginning. I had the usual response after each penalty or reward, but I also began to develop a response just before picking a card from the risky decks. And that response increased as the game continued.
You win $50, but you lose $25.
In other words, according to Damasio, my brain was gradually learning to anticipate the penalty and sending an alarm signal, a gut feeling, if you like, that could be picked up by the polygraph.
The phrase gut feeling is actually a very good one. It just shows that people have been very wise for millennia in spotting the fact that some of their choices are very closely connected to emotions, and they're very closely following on emotions. In other words, the gut feeling is a marker for something that ultimately may be good or bad.
Now here's the key finding. None of Damasio's patients showed this anticipatory response. The neural networks that allow gut feelings about good or bad outcomes to guide rational decision-making are damaged. There's a break in the complex feedback loop of circuits that underpin reason and emotion. And so there's no way to make appropriate social judgments, and no way for the system to be calibrated or tuned by experience.
Sorry, I don't know how long it was. Any comments or questions? I can go through the task. It's kind of a famous task that you might have gone through before. So basically, there's been a number of kind of formal studies of things like this. So this is characteristics of patients who have bilateral orbitofrontal cortex. So you've got the orbitofrontal cortex here, and it's often called the ventromedial, is what goes up in the middle. But it's one system that is kind of at the bottom of your frontal lobes that's involved in kind of evaluating current rewards and punishments. So again, do you want to eat chocolate now when you're full versus not, that kind of evaluations. And what you find with people who have damage to this region, so they're bad at reading kind of facial and vocal expressions. That's one thing that we covered in the lecture on faces. They're also less likely to respond to the emotions in others through comfort or reassurance. They're less cooperative, more impatient. So they have a kind of anger-based, frustration-based anger. They also have problems in social relations and so on. but this also correlates with various formal measures to do with using emotion in decision making, such as the Damasio task, in which all of a sudden you're making a risky response, and you're having to avoid choosing something that used to give you $100, but now is very risky. They don't seem to have that kind of ability. So what about how do they perform an actual test of moral judgment? So originally, when Damasio tested them, he tested them on some of the scenarios that Piaget and Kohlberg had used. So this is the very kind of philosophical reasoning about the husband who's stealing drugs in order to pay for his wife's sickness because he hasn't got the right healthcare plan and so on. And they kind of engage through this high-level logical reasoning in an okay way. So initially, when Damasio tested these patients, they seemed to do well on that. And basically, over the years, a very different pattern has emerged. And that's because different kinds of tests have been used that involve, in effect, the more moral instinct or more an intuition-based, feeling, rather than this kind of, philosophical how should a person behave in that kind of scenario, which is probably based on kind of cultural knowledge and so on. So one of the exceptions that Damasio originally found is that all these patients here have acquired orbitofrontal cortex damage, which means that they were normally socially functioning for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, however old they were when they had their brain damage. So losing the orbitofrontal cortex seems to enable you to engage in this high-level moral reasoning. Whereas if you damage it in childhood, these are people who were in and out of prison, all kinds of problems in daily life, but they also fared poorly on these kind of more abstract moral reasoning. So there is a difference here between them, and it might be that in order to set up this kind of more reasoning-based system, you actually need in place from an early age this kind of more moral intuition, gut instinct, more affective, more emotional system from an early age. Whereas in adulthood, you can somehow get rid of that affective system and make some moral judgments correctly, but not all. Then basically what happened more recently is that they gave them moral dilemmas and basically saying, how would you behave, rather than how ought a person to behave in this kind of reasoning contract. So here, this would be the kind of footbridge and trolley dilemmas and so on. And what they tend to do is that they tend to adopt the more utilitarian perspective of saying, well, it's always going to be better to kill one life than kill 5 lives, okay? And they don't situate it in the particular context of that setting. In one case, they're having to do the pushing of the person and so on. So again, this is the idea that the orbitofrontal cortex involving contextual integration of kind of emotions. So it's not that their morals are absent, okay? They are capable of some moral judgment, so abstract moral judgments if it's late brain damage, and they perform well on the impersonal. So that's the trolley dilemma, whether to flick the switch. So basically, this killed me when I saw it, but basically the figure in my book has all the key is completely wrong. So I don't know how many people have drawn the wrong conclusion. But anyway, the arrow here is the correct one. So on the impersonal dilemma, here you've got patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this is what extends into the orbitofrontal cortex. These are BDC, brain damage controls, normal controls. So these are non-moral reasoning judgment, or non-moral judgments. These are impersonal judgments. So this is the trolley dilemma in which you flick the switch over. So basically, patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage do flip the switch over, as do other brain damage controls, as do normal controls. But in the personal dilemmas, the kind of pushing the person off, they are more inclined to push them off, whereas other brain damage controls and normal controls do not, are not so inclined to do that. Okay. Right. Okay, so any questions about it? So again here, the idea is that they are capable of using, performing some moral judgments, but not on the basis of gut instinct. They can do it on the basis of comparing 5 versus 1 and other kinds of information, or in the case of knowledge of the legal system and so on, their knowledge of, you know, what's consensually defined as right or wrong seems to be relatively intact, provided it's later quite damage. So let's have a look at some other scenarios to kind of tax you, and then I'll mention the study on autism and get you to think about how autism might fit into this sort of story. These take a little bit of time to think about. Anyway, Grace and her friend are taking a tour of a chemical plant. When Grace goes over to the coffee machine to pour some coffee, Grace's friend asks for some sugar in hers. There is white powder in a container by the coffee. The white powder is a very toxic substance left behind by a scientist and therefore deadly when ingested in any form. The container is labelled sugar. Okay, so that's important. So Grace believes that the white powder by the coffee is sugar left out by the kitchen staff. Grace puts the substance in her friend's coffee. Her friend drinks the coffee and dies. Okay. So putting the substance in was... So I'll get you to come up with an answer with a friend because you might need to reread it. Okay. Okay, so I can hear people debating it, and basically it's at this end. You know, some people are saying, "Oh, well, she's silly," you know, but come on, it's this end, right? It's permissible. Have a look at this one. So Dan is giving a visitor a tour of a laboratory. Before visitors enter the testing room, all test tubes containing disease antigens must be contained in a chamber by flipping a switch. A repairman has just come to fix the switch, which had been broken. The switch has been successfully repaired, so the test tubes are quite safely contained. Thus, anybody who enters the room will be safe and unexposed. Dan believes that the switch is still broken after a conversation with the repairman, so he believes it is not safe to enter the room. Dan tells the visitor to enter the testing room. The visitor does not contract any disease and is fine. So telling the visitor to enter was forbidden or permissible. So again, have a think about that. Yeah, well, that's a good, yeah. Okay, so so it's clear, it's kind of this. I mean, there are issues with these kinds of scenarios, which I think it would be good to discuss, that you're having to buy in to this kind of altered reality, right? Okay, why is Dan doing this? You know, you have to kind of take a bit of a leap of faith. So this is the discussion paper. I'll just show you the results and then get you to kind of discuss them. So basically what you have here, so in this case, basically the outcome is fine. The visitor does not contract any disease and fine. So the outcome is okay, the intention is bad. Okay? This one here, the outcome is bad, the intention is good. Okay? So this is why it's kind of interesting in terms of the sorts of cognitive processes we've been talking about, that you've got somebody's intentionality and you've got the kind of the outcome-based endpoints that are potentially in conflict. So you've got these two situations here. So neutral, neutral, negative, negative. So these are the two conflicting ones where the intention is neutral, the outcome is negative. These are the two interesting ones here. Basically, what you find is that people with autism, so this is the group here, that they assign moral blame to an accidental harm. So the accidental harm is this one here. the putting the sugar in. They perform normally on that one here. Okay? So what I want you to do is think about what is going on here in terms of what kind of mechanism is at play. If you read the paper, think about what else they tried to control for, whether that... So I won't be kind of coming back to morality really, but what I will be coming back to is the idea of the social dysfunction after orbitofrontal cortex damage, but also other things related to that, such as antisocial behaviour. Why do people break the rules, in effect, and what's going on there? So aggression can be considered any behaviour directed toward another individual that is carried out with the proximate intent to cause harm. So again, here you've got this word intent, so there's something kind of interesting about intention versus accidental here. And again, this is something that's, you know, enshrined in the law as well. If you kill somebody accidentally, it's got very different outcomes from killing somebody on purpose. So intentionality, you know, it does matter. It is in our kind of culture as well as in our heads. And we can kind of think of aggression as kind of acting against group harmony, norms of fairness, acting against the welfare of others. Perhaps what's perhaps not immediately apparent is that obviously it has functions as well. So you can defend your physical self through aggression, you can defend your reputation, you can maintain social order often through aggressive tactics. So punishment is kind of, and you know, can be seen as an institutionalized form of aggression in which you are intending to harm others in order to get them to conform and comply with whatever the rest of the group says you must do. You know, so this can be turned on its head that way as well. And really, I think, you know, we should be careful about ascribing kind of too much judgment value to this. So aggression is something that most species do and have. And really we have to kind of think about it in the context in which it's used and so on. So also we can think of different kinds of aggression as well, having somewhat different functions. So one broad distinction that's been made is between instrumental aggression and reactive aggression. So instrumental aggression is often kind of resource control. I want that. I'm having that partner. I'm having that food or whatever, and going goal directed. Whereas reactive aggression, it tends to be more threatened. I'm threatened. I can't get my own way. I'm stamping my feet. This kind of thing. And also, this is important to kind of think about when we're talking about potential, you know, disorders or disruption towards this. So. For instance, psychopathy, which I'll go through, is often kind of conceptualized as a lack of empathy, but we've already thought about autism in terms of kind of a lack of empathy. So what's going on here? Well, again, you know, people who are psychopathic tend to have what I would call instrumental aggression. They use other people as kind of a means to an end to get their own way. So there's an element of kind of cruelty and so on. People with autism typically aren't cruel. But they can show particularly reactive aggression, so frustration, tantrums from hell, this kind of thing, where, you know, but it's not a kind of a goal-directed, cruel aggression necessarily that's seen in autism. So there is an aggressive tendency in autism, but it's very different. And again, we can think of what kind of empathy mechanisms might be different between autism versus other sorts of occurrences. But it's also worth saying that a lot of aggression is not faked aggression, it's postural aggression. So posturing, vocalizations, expression, anger. So a lot of what aggression is actually isn't necessarily causing harm. It's about status. It's like you get in your place or whatever. It's about this kind of situation. So in the animal world, it's quite rare for, you know, things to result in death. They can result in injury, but typically it's about establishing ranks and positions and hierarchies rather than actually killing or maiming and so on. So again, when it comes to intentions, we can think of an intention to cause harm, but often the intention is to gain rank or status or prestige with this, and the means is kind of the harm. The end point is not the harm. The end point is something else that's over and above that. Access to resources, this sort of thing. In humans, again, aggression varies a lot cross-culturally, and this has kind of led some to think, well, if you've got this massive difference in murder rates, for instance, that maybe there's no biological basis to aggression, even though pretty much every social species displays it. And in fact, just because there's variability doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of a systematicity. Doesn't mean variability isn't the same as randomness, okay? So cultures do vary a lot in this kind of regard. So here we've got homicides per million. But here we've got income inequality, that you measure the distance between, say, the upper 10% and the lower 10% and see how close they are, obviously scaled towards what the average income is. So you're just looking at the spread of the bell curve. And you can show that income inequality predicts murder rates. So the idea here is that, that there are reasons why people might be aggressive in this kind of more sociological sense. So here we've got an interesting few outliers. You've spotted the USA up here, Finland here. And the idea here is that this doesn't necessarily mean that there's more aggression. It's kind of more to do with legal status of guns and so on. So if the USA had different gun laws, the idea is it would be down here. Singapore has high income equality, but does not have, has very strict kind of rules of possession. So there's probably, some fighting and stuff going on, but it's not resulting necessarily in death. So again, there are these differences. So other people have it's not justifying violence, but it's kind of thinking about antisocial disturbances in kind of trying to get out of a very constraining environment, that you're trying to steal or get ahead using the tools that are available to you. But I don't mean that in any way of kind of justifying it, but just saying that there is an underlying logic and it's not random the way that this works. But again, there are, so there's, I've forgotten the name of the researchers, but they've done this social psychology, but it's all to do with the culture of honour, when it's kind of okay to to use violence when somebody's done wrong to you. So the kinds of situations there is that somebody's called your girlfriend an ugly pig or something like that. Is it okay to hit them? Okay, so although in general people think that hitting is not okay, there are some cultures in which that is okay, and you get it in certain US states, and you get it in Hispanic cultures, Mexico, and so on. So here, these are death penalties. So you can think of this as kind of a legalized way of dealing with the culture of honour, that you get it in certain states. So 50 plus executions and so on, versus those which don't have the culture of honour. They don't enshrine that in the law. So again, the idea that the laws kind of reflecting variability. So, violence can be accepted. If you're killing a murderer, for instance, that's okay, at least in some contexts and some cultures. Yep. So this is just putting in context. So this is an interesting figure. I mean, here you've got two different cultures, but they're not wildly different. You've got Chicago and you've got England and Wales. And effectively what you seem to do when you put them on top of each other is that they look the same. So down here we've got females, and here we've got the amounts of people committing murder, okay? And then here we've got males from the two countries and the amount that are committing murder. But what differs is the actual scales. Okay, so this is Chicago with all the zeros here, and this is the UK, and it is scaled per million. So you could easily look at these and show, well, because they're differing by a factor of 10, that this cannot be biology. This is all to do with culture. But there's clearly something about being a male in your early 20s that matters, okay, irrespective of whether you're in Chicago or whether you're in this country. And what culture can do is it can either magnify this or suppress it, but there is something there that culture is working with, and it's not entirely created by culture. So I think that's a very interesting graph. I'd be interested to see really different cultures, you know, but I don't know how you get the data on that. So that's kind of a little bit of scene setting in terms of, you know, biology versus culture, really. And, you know, clearly both are important. It's not one or the other, it's a bit of both. How do the two come together? So in terms of kind of basic cognitive processes, it's generally thought that the emotion of anger has a particular role to play in this kind of behaviour. So anger also is unusual in that it kind of appears in Ekman's basic emotions, but it's also one of the moral emotions, in that you feel anger by somebody else's behaviour, that their behaviour has kind of violated your rights or your norms or something towards you. Okay, so it straddles kind of a basic emotion and a moral emotion in the sense in which we encountered it earlier. So the idea here is that displays of anger signal aggressive intentions. And there are various models that kind of deal with this. The idea is that basically what you have is frustration, and this is kind of a trigger. So frustration might be to do with inequality, being marginalised. It might be to do with, you know, somebody's treated you badly. Anger is kind of the mediating emotion, and aggression is the outcome that may or may not happen. So you've got frustration, which is kind of very contextually situated, anger, which is clearly a kind of a core human emotion, and then aggression, which again can be partly culturally situated. Is it okay to to hit somebody in the face for insulting me or, you know, my girlfriend or whatever it might be? So that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the different elements from the very basic point of view of what might be biology and what might be culture. So anger typically has various effects on people. So here you've got subliminal, it looks like the Incredible Hulk, but this is just coincidental. You've got a subliminal presentation of an angry face. And what you're doing here is that you're doing a Stroop task. Okay, so here you just have to say green, and what that stimulus is that they've effectively cut up the angry face into strips and rearranged it. So I'm sure we could do it on a computer, but that's what they did. And in some cases you've got red or whatever. And basically, if we look at this one here, what you can show is that people who are angry people, so these are people, you fill in a questionnaire about how angry you get and so on, that when they see an angry face, they are slow at responding with green. It's kind of like they're attending towards it, isn't it? So attentional bias, so they tend more towards the green here rather than away from. So their attention is drawn to that stimuli. It's a facilitating effect when they're saying the word green, as opposed to those people who are not very angry. So anger is kind of interesting because we talk about emotions in terms of mirroring. So if you see somebody happy, the idea is you feel happy too. If you see somebody being angry and you are somebody who considers yourself to be a very dominant person, you will reciprocate with anger. But if you're a timid person, you will respond with fear. So you don't necessarily mirror anger with anger. It depends on your own trait. So here, this is looking at anxious people, and the results don't come out here. That's general anxiety. If you take people with social anxiety, you get exactly the opposite pattern, that people who are socially anxious attend away from that face, whereas people who aren't socially anxious tend to attend towards it. So how you process anger, again, depends on your kind of perceived status, whether you are a kind of an angry person or a socially anxious person. It depends on how you respond to stimulus. Okay, I'll come back to that. But it's to do with testosterone. Yeah, I'll come back to that. But also the amygdala is seen as being very important in anger, just as it is in fear. You tend not to have problems in recognizing facial anger after amygdala damage in quite the same way. But the idea is that the amygdala is involved in the fight or flight response. and it's kind of more of a modulatory influence on aggressive behaviour rather than being the major hub of aggression. So if you lesion the amygdala, you disrupt social hierarchy. So I think I showed you this before. But these are three monkeys here at the top of a social hierarchy. So we've got Dave, who's dominant, self-assured and feared. Zeki, who's an aggressive attacker. Reva, who's aggressive and active. After an amygdala lesion, basically, Reva becomes ultra-aggressive, more dominant, unpredictably vicious, whereas these two become tame. So what you find is after amygdala damage, it disrupts your aggression, but it can actually push it both ways. You can either become more aggressive or less aggressive. And there seems to be a reason for this. So this is more defensive rage rather than instrumental aggression, so responding to threats and so on to you. I won't go through this model here, but the amygdala is clearly not one thing. It's got multiple networks, and basically what you find is that stimulating different aspects of the amygdala can either increase or reduce this tendency for rage and aggressive displays. And what you've got is some pathways which are excitatory. So the idea is that this is kind of the bodily kind of show of in the cats or whatever it is. But there are other pathways which are inhibitory. So again, the idea is that the amygdala is part of the fight or flight. It's either making you want to run away or making you want to stand and fight, and you've got different circuits passing through it. And this is why lesioning to it seems to have this paradoxical result. It's more to do with where the lesions are and how these networks are configured that go through it. Okay. This is more curious. So the ventral striatum, up until now, I kind of naively labelled this as part of your reward system of the brain. So what on earth is this doing? What on earth is its role in kind of anger and aggression? But it does seem to be involved in that. So recognising anger in facial expressions can be disrupted after lesions here. And again, there's kind of a bit of a dopamine story involving this region. So dopamine is seen as being reward-based learning within the ventral striatum and so on. One theory behind this is that the ventral striatum is involved in kind of motivated behaviour or kind of seeking out rewards. So although we think of anger as being bad, it's the idea is that you are kind of motivated to make reparations, or the being angry is kind of a positive motivator to go and deal with certain situations. But you might, from first principles, not expect this to come out, but this is a region that is involved in anger and aggression, as well as being involved in basic rewards. So winning some money and this sort of thing will activate that, but it's involved in anger. What about our orbitofrontal cortex that we've encountered before? There's a whole debate about this as to what's going on. I mean, you certainly, if you think about anger, you activate these regions, but it's actually involved in lots of kind of emotional feelings as well. It's not clear it's specialised for anger in any particular way. It's certainly the case that patients with damage here can show more reactive aggression. So again, this is more the frustration-based aggression, but they don't necessarily have instrumental aggression. But this also partly depends on when the damage has occurred. If you damage it in childhood, you do show instrumental aggression as well, that you will go out and beat people up and steal and so on. Right, so testosterone is seen as being part of this network in that it affects activity in various brain regions. So in the same way as oxytocin is a hormone that kind of acts as a neurotransmitter, testosterone kind of has similar effects as well. So here, what you have there is that you're shown neutral faces, happy faces or angry faces. I'm not sure whether this is with men or women. I think you get similar effects in both. but you have either placebo or testosterone. I can't remember how testosterone is administered, whether it's injections or whether it's nasal. But anyway, you get a clear effect. So here you've got your change in heart rate, but after being given testosterone, you show a strong physiological response to anger in a way that you don't with happy. So it's not just kind of a general upregulation of emotion. It seems to be upregulating certain emotional circuits more than others. Okay? So it increases the physiological response to anger. The resting levels of testosterone in men correlates with increased activity in your orbitofrontal cortex when viewing angry faces. But it correlates negatively with amygdala activity. So it's affecting this circuit in various ways. So it might be here biasing it more towards fight than flight, for instance, would be the response on the amygdala. But the idea it's affecting these kinds of brain circuits that we've talked about quite a lot. And there's obviously a whole theory about how testosterone is linked to aggression. But it's not necessarily aggression in terms of violence and so on. It can be social dominance, so competitive like behaviour and so on. So here, this is looking at resting levels of testosterone, so not experimentally administered testosterone. So there are different paradigms here, just as there are with oxytocin. But what was interesting in this study by Ehrenkrantz is that you've got different groups of male inmates. You've got some who are socially dominant and violent, and some who are socially dominant and non-violent. But what they find here is that testosterone is related to social dominance rather than to violence per se. Okay, so it's more to do with kind of status and resource control and power. Yes, exactly. Than it is to do with actual violence. So violence is an outcome, a potential outcome of that. If you believe that's correct, if that's your kind of history, if you're taught to respond to things with violence and so on. Here they have various measures of violence, antisocial behaviour and so on, and again show relationship between testosterone and these measures. What's interesting about this is that you've got a strong modulation by this cultural factor here of socio-economic status. And what that effectively means is that if you are of a high status anyway, then your level of testosterone is not a good predictor of your behaviour. Whereas if you are a low status person, your level of testosterone is a good predictor of your behaviour. So it's almost, if you're high status, you haven't got to break the rules in order to get what you want. If you're low status, you kind of have to break the rules, and this gives your brain the helping hand that you might need in order to do that. Okay, so you've got this interesting interaction here between biology and, in effect, where you happen to be, an environmental thing, where you are on a social ladder, where you're born, which neighbourhood you're in, this kind of thing. So one of the interesting things is the mechanism here. And one of the reasons why the mechanism behind testosterone is puzzling is the direction of cause and consequence. And basically the evidence is that testosterone is both a cause of certain behaviour but also a consequence. So this is things done where people are competing, and you can do sports or chess, and what you do is you take the level of testosterone prior to and after engaging in, say, a chess match, and you can say that before a chess match both players are equated, and then afterwards what happens is that the winner's testosterone level goes up and the loser's testosterone level goes down. And you get it both for the same with rugby and for chess and so on. Okay, so it's not rough and tumble, it's something more than that. But the idea here is that you're kind of using this in order to kind of modulate future behaviour. If you've lost something, you don't want to go into a fight straight away. It's reducing your kind of competitiveness away. If you've won, you want to take on the next guy, okay, and go up potentially. That it's having this sort of effect. What's really interesting is that you get this effect vicariously through social situations. So this is the US election in, I think, 2008 that Obama one, and basically you take Democrats and Republicans before the vote and after the vote, and you can show that all the Democrats' testosterone levels go up after Obama's wins and the Republicans go down. Okay, and you get this, in World Cup matches and so on. When your team wins, your testosterone goes up. So it's not about you winning. Again, it's this idea of yourself in a group, that your group winning is like you winning as well. It's the same kind of effect that we talked about last week. So these here are kind of observational studies, and these are experimental studies in which you administer testosterone relative to some kind of placebo. And what you find here is that, again, you're biasing these kinds of circuits involved in reward. So your ventral striatum involved in both anger perception and in reward. If you administer testosterone, then it increases your... So again, these are some kind of neuroeconomic gains that are being played here. But the activity in your reward circuitry goes up when you're kind of winning or competing, and it changes your behavior. You trust less and you're less generous in this case. Okay, more competitive and less trusting of others in effect. Okay, so I'll finish off by talking about more pathological aspects of aggression. So we now have a DSM-5, actually. I'm not quite sure what it's called now. I'm assuming it's probably still called antisocial personality disorder, but that's what it was called in the last round. But basically, before this, it used to be called sociopathy, and before that, it used to be called psychopathy. But the idea here is that this name has kind of changed in various DSMs, and the idea here is that psychopath is seen as being too negative a label. I mean, I don't know who would want to be called having antisocial personality disorder. It's slightly more euphemistic, but it's hardly an attractive badge of honour. But it's typically defined as a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. So this is kind of your morality again in here, that begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood. And basically, as with these DSM criteria, you're given a checklist, and it includes things such as a failure to conform to social norms, irritability and aggressiveness, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, or having shallow or seemingly non-existent feelings. So this is what Damasio found in his patients with orbitofrontal cortex damage, and he labelled them acquired sociopathy, where sociopathy was the name that was involved in the early 1990s. And acquired meaning that clearly this didn't come around in childhood and adolescence. These were people who behaved normally socially, then damaged their brain, and then acquired this particular behavioural pattern. But it does exist. Most people probably know somebody with this, or probably more likely to know a male who has it, because it's at least 3 to 4 times more common in males than females. And obviously it's overrepresented in prison populations and so on. Right, so these labels are a real kind of issue in the literature, because people apply them somewhat differently, and they have different criteria. So the American Psychiatric Association has effectively said that these 3 things are all the same. Robert Hare is a Canadian psychiatrist who kind of has been a leader in psychopathy research, and he argues that psychopathy is rather different, or a distinct category within what the DSM call. He's had a big fallout with the American Psychiatric Association about it. He's sued other authors and so on. You can read about it online. There's these kind of wranglings over the term psychopathy. But he has his own kind of checklist, but he also kind of focuses on personality traits. So for him, he's got other criteria such as glibness and superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, and so on. So he's effectively going for a subgroup within that. That's the way he's thought about that. And he's got his own checklist, which is somewhat different to what the others have. But his point is that it's more to do with the way that they think, their personality style, rather than their actual behaviour in terms of aggressiveness and so on. This is James Blair, which Blair it was, but he kind of makes a distinction here between psychopathy being more instrumental aggression, going out and getting what you want using any means, versus antisocial personality disorder being a more kind of reactive, kind of frustration-based aggression. I'm not happy where I am, I'm going to go out, you know, and break a few windows or whatever it is. It's, yeah. So when you read this literature, I don't know whether there's an essay question about it, you certainly want to spend a paragraph or two talking about this and then thinking about what is actually meant by these labels, because it's a bit curious. So what about psychopaths, and how, coming back to morality briefly, how do they perform? So here, this is a test of the so-called moral conventional distinction. And basically, what Blair did, these are a group of convicted murderers in Broadmoor, I think, who are basically asked, they're given a set of dilemmas and they're asked, is this wrong, and if not, why? And the correct answer for a lot of them is that this is wrong because it's going to hurt somebody, they're not going to like it. Whereas what a psychopath will say is that it's wrong because it's against the law. So what, in effect, they do is that they justify moral decisions in terms of adherence to social norms, whereas other people justify kind of violations of these in terms of welfare for others. So the idea here is that they haven't got this distinction between moral norms and conventional norms. For them, hitting somebody is seen as being a conventional transgression that, you know, it's just there because the government tells us not to do it or so, and it's not there, you know, it's perfectly fine in some context to do that. So it's that kind of style of thinking. But they do actually perform normally on the trolley and Footbridge Dilemma. They do perform normally on these tests. So again, they know what the law is. They don't have this kind of utilitarian bias to always kind of save one life, save 5 life and lose one. They show the same kind of pattern of differences on these tasks here. So it's more the case that they choose to disregard the norms and that they're not kind of engaged in maybe the more gut instinct. Yeah, so this is Jack Nicholson. So what they do actually have is, again, a very old finding, is that they have abnormal fear conditioning. So this is just a kind of a classic kind of study in which you've got certain tones, and some tones trigger some tones trigger electric shock and others don't. And here you can measure the skin conductance response and see whether or not they can learn that association. So actually, in that respect, it is similar to some of Damasio's patients in that particular thing, but they're impaired at that. They show reduced amygdala activity in fear conditioning and reduced autonomic activity when they see fear and sad in others. So one idea is that basically they're struggling to recognise the effects of distress in others. That this kind of then, because they're not kind of feeling other people's fear and so on, that they can then transgress against other people, in ways in which most people do. That this kind of stopping, checking mechanism that we all have, when it comes to harming others, is not necessarily in place. Okay. And again, they've done studies looking at vignettes. So they have problems in recognising guilt. From vignettes, they describe guilt in terms of happiness or indifference, for instance. But they do find things like embarrassment or sadness. So embarrassment is within Haidt's kind of distinction. It is a kind of a moral emotion. But guilt obviously perhaps involves particular kinds of mechanisms. They do show differences in the orbitofrontal cortex as well, in various tasks. So the issue here really is whether or not is how to interpret that. So one possibility is that they've kind of got an emotional blunting in their the orbitofrontal cortex because they are adopting a different kind of strategy. So it's not that they can't do that, it's more of a strategic thing that they are engaging in a different kind of moral judgment, not one based on intuitions or kind of sharing other people's fear and emotions, but more in terms of their own kind of status and wants and their own, I guess, more outcome-focused responding. So it doesn't necessarily mean from this that they have a problem with that part of the brain. It could just be a different kind of style of thinking. I don't know. It's kind of open, and people debate these things here. Any questions about psychopathy? So this I just kind of introduce as an interesting kind of aside in terms of a similar sort of thing in children. So there is this formal diagnostic category called conduct disorder, which is seen as being a more childhood variant of antisocial personality disorder. But because it's not been present, throughout the lifespan, you can't give it that formal diagnostic. It's seen as kind of being pre that kind of category.
Isn't the step up from that, like if a child has conduct disorder, the next step is oppositional defiant disorder?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not well up on this. Yeah, you might be right. What's oppositional defiant?
It's basically conduct disorder, but in like adolescence,
right?
Through early, adulthood,
okay.
Whatever, and then it becomes
antisocial.
Right.
Yeah. I suspect you're right. Yeah. So here, there are various studies looking at this. So one is an fMRI study looking at effectively empathy for pain. What's curious about this is that so here you're shown images of somebody else in pain versus neutral image, and obviously what you expect in your controls is that you will activate your pain matrix, so parts of the regions of the brain involved in processing pain, and you do. What you might not expect is that you might expect the conduct disorder group to activate their pain matrix less, that they show less of this kind of empathic showing of pain. But that's not the case. They actually do show an equivalent level of activity in these parts of the brain. What is very curious is that when they see other people in pain, they activate this ventral striatum region, which is a region that's implicated in reward. It's implicated in anger. It's really not clear what's going on here. I mean, if you remember, you do also get this in. So if you're giving pain to somebody who you think's deserve it, you also activate your ventral striatum, but you do dampen down your pain matrix. So it's kind of almost this conflicting response that they seem to be empathizing at one level, but there are different circuits that seem to be coming into play here, and what their functional significance is kind of up for grabs in terms of what's going on. But in terms of kind of theory of mind and so on, this is looking at bullying rather than conduct disorder. But again, you tend to find high social intelligence in people who are bullying, where you've got this kind of, really it's a form of aggression, in effect, there's no other way of putting it. But it's certainly not that they are poor in terms of social understanding. So again, I haven't really talked so much about autism, but people with autism, I can't pull out a study from my head, but I'd be amazed if they engaged in bullying. It's just not something that that would fit with that kind of profile. And why would they? It kind of implies, this kind of understanding of others. Whereas victims of bullying seem to have less social intelligence that they on this. So you can kind of predict more who's going to be a victim from measures of social cognition than you can who's going to be a bully and who isn't. It's a sad. Okay, so the idea here is that you've got good social intelligence, but either a willingness or ability to ignore the effects on the victims. That seems to be kind of the story here in children. It seems to be a similar story in psychopathy, is that people know right from wrong, in terms of various dilemmas and so on, but for whatever reason it does not translate into their own actions and behaviour. Anything else? Okay, so that's really all I had to say. So I think they're two separate topics, but there's some nice kind of links between them, really, and we kind of come back to morality when we think about pathological aspects of aggression.